The wind had been turning mean for a week. It came off the bluffs with a sound like tearing canvas, carrying dust that coated everything in a fine red grit. It scoured the paint from the barn and rattled the single window pane in Elias's small cabin. A lonely sound for a lonely man. He had lived with that sound for 7 years, ever since Martha's grave was new. The silence inside the house had been louder than any wind. He saw them first as a wavering line on the horizon, a dark stitch on the faded fabric of the prairie. 10 riders, too many for a friendly visit, too disciplined for bandits. As they drew closer, their size became apparent, broad-shouldered men who seemed to wear the landscape as easily as they wore their leather. Patchy. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that raised the hairs on Elias's arms. He stood on his porch, a hand resting on the weathered axe handle that leaned against the wall. Not as a threat, but as an old habit, a comfort. His face was a map of dry seasons and long winters, his eyes the color of a faded sky. He did not move as they rode into his yard, the dust lifting behind their ponies like ghosts. The 10 men formed a half-circle, their horses breathing steam into the cold air. They were giants, each one, their presence sucking the very air from the yard. The man at the center, his face like carved rock, dismounted. He wore no paint, but his gaze was heavy with an authority that needed no decoration. He held the reins of a pack mule, and tied to the saddle was a woman. She was not one of them. Her skin was pale beneath the grime, her hair a tangled mat of sun-bleached brown. She was barefoot, her feet cracked and raw. A coarse rope was looped around her waist and tethered to the saddle horn, less a bond to hold her than a leash to lead her. She kept her head down, her whole body curved into a posture of submission, as if trying to make herself small enough to disappear. She clung to her own bones like wet paper. The silence stretched, pulled thin and tight. Elias's knuckles turned white where he gripped the axe handle. He had seen women like this before in dusty towns farther south. Goods to be traded, property to be won or lost at a card table. He had always turned away, a sickness coiling in his gut. The leader's voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. We need water, for our horses. Shelter from the wind for one night. Elias gave a slow, deliberate nod. There's a trough by the barn, a stream beyond the ridge. He did not take his eyes off the woman. The Apache leader followed his gaze. A flicker of something, not pity, but understanding, passed through his dark eyes. We found her 2 days east, running from a man who bought her. A man named Callum. The name meant nothing to Elias. The sight of her meant everything. He brands his stock, the leader continued, his voice flat. He gestured with his chin toward the woman's shoulder, where the ragged fabric of her dress had torn away. Elias saw it then, a raw, puckered mark on her skin. A C. The sickness in his gut became a cold fire. She is not ours, the leader said. We cannot take her where we are going. We cannot leave her for the wolves, or for him. He paused, his eyes locking with Elias's. It was not a plea. It was a weighing, a judgment. We leave her here. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. A stone dropped into the deep well of Elias's solitude. The other 9 men watched, their faces impassive, their silence a tangible pressure. They were not asking him to buy her. They were asking him to be a man. Elias's own life was a hollowed-out thing, a series of chores marking the passage of time. He had nothing to offer, a roof that leaked, bread that was often hard, and a silence that could crush a person. Maybe that was all she needed. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He straightened up, letting his hand fall from the axe. He looked past the imposing leader directly at the woman. Her face was still hidden by the curtain of her hair. I'll take her, he said. The words sounded strange in the open air, thin as a fence rail. The Apache leader held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. He walked to the mule, and with a swift motion of a knife from his belt, he cut the rope. The severed end fell into the dust. He gave her a gentle, almost imperceptible nudge forward. She stumbled, her legs unused to freedom. She took 2 hesitant steps and stopped, her head still bowed, as if waiting for a new rope. Elias walked down the 2 porch steps. He moved slowly, his boots scuffing the dirt. He stopped a few feet from her, careful not to crowd her space. He said nothing. He simply waited. After a moment that felt like an hour, she lifted her head. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sea, empty and vast. He saw the ghost of a person looking out from a cage of fear. He turned without a word and walked back to the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. It was an invitation, nothing more. A refuge offered without condition. He did not look back to see if she followed. He heard the soft, hesitant scuff of her bare feet on the wooden porch steps. He heard the door swing shut, the latch clicking into place with a sound that was both a finality and a beginning. Outside, the Apaches watered their horses and settled in the leah of the barn, their quiet murmurs a temporary shield against the howling wind. Inside, the cabin was filled with the long shadows of dusk. A fire slumbered in the hearth, little more than a bed of orange coals. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke, old wool, and dust. It was the scent of a life lived alone. She stood just inside the door, a silhouette against the fading light, looking as though a loud noise might shatter her. Elias moved to the hearth and coaxed the coals back to life with a few pieces of kindling. Flames licked up, painting the small room in flickering gold and dancing shadow. He did not speak to her. Words were a currency they did not share yet. Instead, he moved with the worn, familiar rhythm of his evening routine. He scooped water from the bucket into a cast-iron pot and hung it over the fire. He sliced thick wedges from a loaf of day-old bread and cut pieces of salted pork from a slab hanging from the rafters. The simple, domestic sounds, the slice of the knife, the clink of the pot, filled the heavy silence. He was aware of her every moment. He felt her stillness as if it were a physical presence. She had not moved from the door. He glanced over his shoulder and saw her watching his hands, her gaze fixed and intense, as if trying to understand a foreign language. When the stew was hot, a thin but nourishing broth with pork and dried beans, he ladled it into 2 wooden bowls. He set one on the small, rough-hewn table. He took the other and sat in his worn armchair by the fire. He ate slowly, deliberately. He gestured with his chin toward the table. Eat, the word was rough from disuse, like a rusty hinge. She flinched at the sound of his voice. For a moment he thought she would refuse, that the fear was too deep. But then, moving with a slowness that spoke of immense pain in her muscles and joints, she shuffled to the table. She did not sit. She stood over the bowl, her hands braced on the tabletop, and ate like a starving animal, her head bent low over the steam. He pretended not to watch. He stared into the fire and listened to the sound of her spoon scraping against the wood of the bowl. It was the first sign of life he had seen from her. Section when she finished, she stood motionless again. Her eyes darted around the small cabin, taking in the single cot in the corner, his own bedroll near the hearth, the closed door that led to Martha's room, a room he had not entered in 7 years. He finished his stew and set the bowl on the floor. He pointed to the cot. It was little more than a frame with a thin mattress stuffed with straw, but he had placed a clean, patched blanket on it. "That's yours," he said. "I don't lock doors." It was a promise, the only one he could think to make. A promise of freedom, a promise that this was not another cage. She looked from the cot to him, her eyes narrowed in a flicker of guarded assessment. Then, without a sound, she crossed the room and lay down on the cot, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. She lay facing the wall, her body rigid. Elias banked the fire for the night and settled into his own bedroll. The wind cried around the corners of the cabin. Inside, for the first time in 7 years, there was the sound of another person's breathing. It did not fill the emptiness. Not yet, but it was a start. It was the sound of a seed falling on barren ground. The Apaches were gone by dawn. They left no trace, save for the tracks of their ponies in the dust, already being erased by the relentless wind. They had taken nothing. They had left a life in his hands. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. He would rise before the sun, light the fire, and go out to do his chores, mending a fence line that was always in need of mending, tending to his 2 bony cows and the half-dozen chickens that provided his eggs. When he came back inside, he would find the floor swept clean of the ever-present dust. A pot of water would be warming by the fire. She moved like a ghost through the small cabin, silent and watchful. She never spoke. He learned the shape of her existence through her actions. She was meticulous. She washed their 2 bowls and 2 spoons after every meal and set them precisely on the shelf. She mended a tear in his shirt with stitches so small and neat they were nearly invisible. He found the thread she had used, pulled carefully from the hem of her own ragged dress. The gesture was so profound in its quiet sacrifice that it left a lump in his throat. He, in turn, offered his own silent kindnesses. He left a pair of Martha's old leatherwork boots by the door. They were too big for her, but better than bare feet. He saw her stuff them with scraps of cloth to make them fit. He noticed her wince as she lifted the heavy water bucket and, the next day, he rigged a pulley system at the well to make the task easier. He left a small cake of lye soap by the wash basin, a luxury he rarely afforded himself. They worked in parallel, 2 solitary planets orbiting the same small sun of the hearth. He would be splitting wood in the yard, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat, and he would feel her eyes on him from the doorway. She would be kneading dough for bread, her hands clumsy but determined, and she would look up to find him watching her from his chair. A look would pass between them, not of intimacy, but of acknowledgement. "I see you. You are here." One afternoon, he came back from the far pasture to find her standing by Martha's grave. It was a simple plot, marked by a plain wooden cross he had carved himself. It was overgrown with weeds, a testament to his own neglect, a patch of ground he could hardly bear to look at. She was on her knees, her back to him, methodically pulling the tough, thorny weeds from the earth. Her movements were gentle, respectful. She cleared the space around the cross, tidied the stones that marked the border. When she was done, she simply knelt there for a long moment, her head bowed. Elias stood by the barn, his heart a tight, aching knot in his chest. No one had tended that grave but him, and he had done so poorly, his grief a wall he could not breach. To see this stranger, this voiceless girl, offer a kindness to a woman she had never known. It was a key turning in a lock that had rusted shut for years. Later that day, she found a single, stubborn prairie wildflower, a splash of defiant yellow against the brown earth. She put it in a tin cup of water and set it on the table. It was the first color that had entered the house in a long time. That night, a storm broke. Not just wind, but a driving, furious rain that hammered the roof and streamed down the window pane like tears. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the world splitting apart. A cry from the corner of the room tore through the noise of the storm. A sharp, terrified sound. Elias sat up from his bedroll. She was thrashing on the cot, caught in the grip of a nightmare. Her thin voice cried out words he couldn't understand, a tangled plea of, "No, please, don't." He got up. He didn't go to her. He knew a sudden touch might be a terror, not a comfort. Instead, he pulled his chair away from the fire and placed it a few feet from her cot, so he was a solid shape in the dim, flickering light. He sat down. He didn't speak. He just sat there, a silent, unmoving guardian, a sentry against the ghosts that haunted her sleep. He sat until her thrashing subsided, until her panicked breaths evened out into the slow rhythm of sleep. He sat until the storm passed and the only sound was the drip of water from the eaves. Only then did he return to his bedroll, the cold floor seeming less cold than before. The next morning, she met his eyes across the table. Her own were red-rimmed but clear. For the first time, there was not just fear in them, but a question. He ate his bread, his gaze steady on hers. He wanted her to know she was safe, that here, in this small, broken place, the nightmares did not have to win. She finished her meal and took their bowls to the basin. As she washed them, her voice came, so soft and thin he almost thought it was the wind. "Why?" He looked up, surprised. It was the first word she had spoken to him directly. He thought for a long moment, watching the firelight play on the rough walls. He could have said 100 things. That he was lonely. That he saw his own wife's ghost in her eyes. That it was a duty. But he settled on the simplest truth. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said. She nodded, a small, jerky motion. She did not speak again that day, but the silence had changed. It was no longer an absence. It was a space they were beginning to share. The news traveled the way it always did in that sparse country, on the wind and the tongue of a lone rider. A man from a neighboring ranch, miles to the south, stopped for water and saw her hanging laundry on the line, a bright patch of mended cloth against the endless brown. He tipped his hat, his eyes full of questions, and ridden on. 2 weeks later, the harbinger arrived. 3 riders, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. Elias saw them from the barn. His gut went cold. These were not Apaches. They rode with a lazy, arrogant slouch. One man was out front, taller than the others, dressed in clothes that were a little too fine for the frontier. She saw them too. She was on the porch, shelling beans into a wooden bowl. The bowl slipped from her lap, spilling the beans across the weathered planks. All the color drained from her face. She scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the sight of them until her back hit the cabin wall. The ghost was back in her eyes, stark and terrified. Elias walked out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He moved without hurry, placing himself between the riders and the porch. He recognized the man in front now, Callum. He had seen him once in a trading post, a man with a cruel mouth and eyes that assessed everything, and everyone, for a price. "Elias," Callum said, his voice smooth and oiled. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you'd taken in a stray. Came to collect my property." He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling. His gaze slid past Elias to the woman cowering by the door. "There you are, girl. Gave me quite a run. But the world ain't as big as you think." Elias stood his ground. He was a shorter man than Callum and leaner, but he felt rooted to the earth. This patch of dirt was his. This house was his. And the woman behind him was under his protection. "She's not property," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "And she's not going with you." Callum laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, I think she is. I got a bill of sale signed and proper. Paid a good price for her. She belongs to me by law." He took a step forward. "The law don't reach this far," Elias said, his hand moving almost unconsciously to rest on the handle of the woodsman's axe that was always propped by the door. "Everywhere has a law, old man," Callum sneered. He gestured to the 2 men behind him, who dismounted and began to flank him. "And right now I'm it." He started toward the porch steps, his hand outstretched to grab her. "Come on now, girl. No more trouble." What happened next happened in a breath. As Callum's hand reached out, the woman, the silent, fearful ghost, moved. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She surged forward from the wall, her face a mask of cold fury. In her hand, she gripped the heavy iron skillet she'd been about to clean. She swung it with all the force of her wiry body. The skillet connected with Callum's head with a sickening thud, a sound like a melon splitting open. Callum staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face, his hand flying to the side of his head. He stared at her not as property, but as a person who had just struck him down. He saw the fire in her eyes, the defiance. He saw that the broken thing he had bought was no longer broken. She stood there, legs braced, the skillet held before her like a shield. Her voice, when it came, was not the thin whisper he had heard before. It was sharp and clear and full of rage. "No." It was a single word, but it was a declaration. It was the sound of a cage breaking. Elias moved then, stepping in front of her, the axe now firm in his hand. He faced Callum and his 2 stunned men. He did not raise the weapon, but its presence was enough. His eyes were cold as winter stone. "You heard her," he said. "Get off my land." Callum clutched his head, blood trickling through his fingers. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a venomous glare. He looked from Elias's axe to the woman's skillet, to the unyielding set of their faces. He saw two people standing as one. He had come for a possession. He had found a fortress. "This ain't over," he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. He stumbled back to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and rode away, his men scrambling after him. They stood on the porch, Elias and the woman, and watched the dust settle. The air was still. The skillet hung from her hand, heavy at her side. Her knuckles were white. Her whole body trembled, not with fear, but with the aftermath of courage. Elias turned to her. He saw the fierce, terrified pride in her eyes. He saw the woman who had been born in that single act of defiance. "I was scared," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I know," he said softly. He reached out not to touch her, but to take the heavy skillet from her hand. His fingers brushed hers. It was the first time they had touched. Her skin was cold. They went inside. He built up the fire. She sank onto the stool by the hearth, wrapping her arms around herself. He made coffee, strong and black. He handed her a cup, and she took it in trembling hands. They sat in silence, but it was a new silence. It was the quiet of a battle won, of a shared victory. It was the silence of two people who had stood together and had not broken. That night, by the low light of the fire, he looked at her. The fear had receded from her eyes, leaving behind a deep, quiet strength. He had been protecting a stranger, a duty. Now he knew he was protecting a person. "They never gave you a name," he said. "It wasn't a question." She looked into the flames, her profile etched in gold. "My mother called me Lena." She said it as if tasting the word for the first time in years, claiming it. "Lena," he repeated. The name felt right in the quiet cabin. Felt like planting a seed in fertile ground. A few days later, Lena took the ragged, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one marked with Callum's brand. She had washed and mended a spare dress of Martha's, and it hung on her loosely, but it was clean. It was whole. She took the old dress out to the fire pit where Elias burned his rubbish. Without ceremony, she dropped it into the flames. They stood together and watched it burn. They watched the symbol of her bondage, the last remnant of the person she had been, turn to black ash and rise on the wind, disappearing into the vast blue sky. It was a baptism by fire. The house, the land, it had all been his. Now it was theirs. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. He found himself talking more. Small things. Observations about the weather, stories about a stubborn calf, the way Martha used to hum when she baked. He opened the door to his wife's room, not to replace her memory, but to let the sunlight in, to air out the stagnant grief. Lena would go in sometimes, cleaning the dust from the simple furniture, her presence not an intrusion but a continuation, a different kind of life stitching itself into the fabric of the old one. He taught her how to sight down the barrel of his rifle, her shoulder braced against his, her breathing steady. She taught him the names of the wildflowers that grew in the spring, their colors a quiet rebellion against the harshness of the land. One evening, months later, they sat on the porch. The wind was gentle now, carrying the sweet smell of prairie grass after a rain. The world was greening. He had repaired the old porch swing, and they moved in a slow, easy rhythm. The house behind them seemed to breathe, its rooms no longer filled with emptiness, but with a quiet, resilient life. He looked at her, at the way the setting sun caught the gold in her hair, at the small, peaceful smile on her lips. The woman who arrived barefoot and broken was gone. In her place was Lena, strong, whole, home. He cleared his throat. "Lena," he began, his voice a little rough. "A preacher comes through these parts in the spring. I was thinking, maybe—" She stopped the swing with her foot and turned to him. She laid her hand over his, her touch warm and sure. She didn't need him to finish the sentence. Her eyes, the color of the sea after a storm, said everything. Yes. This story, it ain't just about rescue. It's not about a strong man saving a damsel. It's about the quiet courage it takes to stitch a life back together when all you're given is raw, frayed thread. It's about how two broken people, haunted by their own separate winters, can find a way to make a spring. We all have a name that the world tries to take from us. A brand someone tries to put on our soul to say, you are this, you are mine. We are told we are too quiet, too broken, too much, but maybe you have a name you've forgotten, a name your mother gave you, a truth you need to speak, even if your voice trembles. Maybe you have a fire you need to build, to burn away the old rags of who you were told to be. And if you're brave enough to do that, if you're brave enough to stand on your own piece of land and say no to the callums of the world, you might just find you're not standing alone. Because a home isn't four walls and a roof. It is a shared silence. It is a hand that does not flinch. It is the quiet courage to simply stay.